Okay, so here's a basic rundown of the first semester of U.S. history and government, and I only have about 3 minutes, so let's go. Okay, so if you didn't know, before the United States was this, we were actually this.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
So the British colonization of the Americas began in 1607 in the good old town of Jamestown, Virginia. And in the following decades, Britain itself would be responsible for founding major cities today, such as Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. With the British establishment of the 13 colonies, each set of colonies, depending on their region, had a distinct goal and a distinct trade market. In the southern colonies, agriculture was the key focus, while in the northern colonies, lumber, shipbuilding, and other sorts of transportation were key. This further established the use of mercantilism, which allowed for a mother country's colonies to produce products in the interests of the mother country. Within the colonies, some democratic principles were established. Some of these include the Mayflower Compact of 1620, the House of Burgesses, and finally the New England Town Meetings. These institutions were the first representations of equal voice in government in colonial America. The year is 1781. The United States government ratifies the Articles of Confederation, which turns out to be a big flop because the federal government was too weak. So, in 1787, the Great Compromise happened, where small and large states agreed upon how each state would be legislatively represented, which created dual representation on the federal and state level. Another compromise that is extremely racist and controversial is the Three-Fifths Compromise, where slaves were counted as only 3/5 of a person when appointing representatives to a state. It is also crucially important to recognize the fact that federalism came into play at this time, and federalism is pretty much where a general government and a regional governments come together to have a mixed compound government that is aimed at representing all sides of a country. 3 branches of government were formally established: legislative, executive, and judicial. The legislative branch is responsible for creating legislature. The executive branch is responsible for holding the president and for enforcing the laws. And the judicial branch is responsible for checking if any branch or any sort of law is unconstitutional. So anyone can pretty much be appointed to the 3 branches of government. However, they do have to follow these requirements. One other thing to point out, the Electoral College, which is pretty much this giant map you see on every presidential election, was founded in 1787 and allows for the number of electors to be given to each state based on its population. These electorals are then won by the person who wins that state in a presidential election. It's also important to point out that the Supreme Court, held within the judicial branch, is also responsible for upholding important and key Supreme Court cases that shaped the United States' government and how it plays, and here are some examples of which. Jumping to 1803, an average-sized Frenchman named Napoleon Bonaparte sells the Louisiana Territory to the United States, who, conveniently enough, were already looking forward to expanding the United States territory westward. Years later, in 1812, the Empire strikes back as the British and Americans wage war with one another on American soil. This utterly becomes known as the Forgotten War of 1812. Little did the British know, with our low numbers, but with our high morale, the British would burn down Washington, D.C. and the White House. However, the Americans would push them back to the ocean and would win their second war of independence. After U.S. President James Madison came James Monroe, who enacted the famously known Monroe Doctrine in 1823, which sought out to enforce the end of European colonialism and imperialism in Latin and South America. It's also important to recognize the abolitionist movement of the 1830s to the 1870s, where the movement was heavily focused on achieving immediate emancipation of all slaves and the eventual end of racial segregation within America. Harriet Beecher Stowe and Frederick Douglass were well-known figures of the abolitionist movement who sought out to end the racial discrimination and slavery of African Americans, while Sojourner Truth, a ex-slave, is most commonly known for her abolitionist ideals and her ideals in women's rights. In the later half of the 19th century, the northern states and southern states of the United States themselves were in constant tension over the issue of slavery and other post issues. So because of the intense issues, the Congress enacted the Compromise of 1850, which sought out to resolve the conflict between the states. However, it was ultimately ineffective, as in 1860, South Carolina would secede from the Union, and following that, most of the southern states would follow and form the CSA as the Confederate States of America. And finally, during the midst of the American Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln enacted the Emancipation Proclamation, which ultimately freed the southern slaves. However, I would like to come back for my closing remarks, as I do want to mention that the Native Americans prior to the creation of the United States were impacted so greatly that they were forced to relocate from their native tribes, and a large portion of the native population in America were actually killed because of the diseases that the Europeans brought. And even though it's a subject that us today as Americans don't want to look back to, it's important to, because it's important to know the true history behind things.